The universe forgets, but stone remembers. Long before the first pharaohs carved their legacies into the dunes, the Neteru walked the earth, a civilization born from stardust and silence. They built not for glory but necessity. Beneath the future site of Khafre's pyramid, they hollowed a labyrinth of spirals, each turn calibrated to twist time itself. Their machine, the Chronophage, was no monument. It was an apology, a failsafe, a tomb for truths too dangerous to outlive them. They seeded humanity with myths, tales of Juat, the underworld, Amenti, the ledger of souls, but the halls of Amenti were never metaphor. Etched into quantum strata, they stored the breath of every extinguished culture, every silenced tongue. The Neteru knew their own end approached. A cataclysm spun from their hubris and vowed to spare others their fate. Yet even they feared the machine's hunger. To archive a history is to murder it, their final hieroglyphs warned. The engine consumes what it preserves. For millennia, the desert kept their secret. Sand filled the shafts, dynasties rose and fell above the buried Leviathan. But stone remembers. Whispers lingered in the dreams of seers and madmen, visions of an ibis-headed guardian, of walls that bled light, of a choice between salvation and oblivion. Those who listened too closely vanished. Priests entombed with scarab amulets clutched in their fists, explorers whose journals ended mid-sentence, physicists who claimed to hear time breathing. Now the machine stirs again. Its pulse echoes through the bedrock, a dirge only the desperate can hear. It offers answers. It demands sacrifices. And in the shadow of Khafre's pyramid, where past and future claw at the present, the unwise will learn the cost of asking questions older than gods. The Neteru's warning remains, etched in a tongue no living human speaks. Beware the keeper of lost things. It loves you just enough to destroy you. Chapter 1. The desert at dawn was a liar. Its golden serenity masked teeth, the scorch beneath the sand, the way time pooled here like stagnant water. Dr. Idris Nasser knelt at the edge of the newly unearthed shaft, his shadow a stunted thing against Khafre's pyramid. The air tasted of static, of ozone and millennia. He brushed grit from the obsidian slab beneath him, hieroglyphs shimmering like oil on water. They were wrong. Not the rigid symbols of dynastic Egypt, but spirals within spirals, a language that moved when unobserved. His father's voice slithered through his memory. Time isn't a river here, Habibi. It's a serpent eating its own tail. The team had laughed when he had proposed the dig. Chronoarchaeology, stick to pottery shards, Idris. But the satellite scans didn't lie. A labyrinth beneath Khafre, denser than any burial chamber. Now, as the first sunlight crept down the shaft, he felt the weight of eyes that weren't there, the kind that watched from the gaps between seconds. His breath fogged in the chill as he traced the obsidian glyphs. The spirals seemed to coil under his fingertips, alive and resentful. His father's ghost lingered here, in the way the wind hissed through the plateau. You waste your life chasing myths, the old man had spat years before the stroke erased him. But Idris had always known the desert hid more than bones. His wife, Amal, had accused him of the same obsession. You love ruins more than the living, she had said, her suitcase clicking shut. Now, as the first rays of sun ignited the pyramid's apex, he wondered if she had been right. The shaft yawned beneath him, a throat waiting to swallow. 12 meters below, Tarek Qeb's fingers trembled as he adjusted the laser drill. At 23, he had hacked particle accelerators and warped graphene into fourth-dimensional models, but this was a cipher. The shaft walls drank the light, reflecting nothing but faint spirals that squirmed if he blinked. His stomach churned, bile rising in his throat. A machine, he thought, not a tomb, not a temple. The drill's readout flickered, 000000. He recalibrated the wavelength, the beam slicing through obsidian. Gold light bled through the stone, humming like a struck tuning fork. His palms slicked with sweat. The drill's vibrations synced with his pulse, a dissonant rhythm that made his teeth ache. He thought of his mother in Khartoum, her voice on the phone last night. You're too young for this, Habibi. But youth was a currency he had traded for brilliance. The beam pierced the obsidian, and the light that spilled out was hungry. It wrapped around his wrist, warm and sentient. For a moment he saw his reflection in the shaft wall, older, hollow-cheeked, eyes like cracked glass. He jerked back. The drill slipped, its whine crescendoing into a shriek. Above ground, Dr. Safiya Riad gripped her tablet, its screen a storm of quantum noise. Her equations had predicted a temporal anomaly, a knot in spacetime density, but the numbers kept folding into themselves. She had left Beirut to escape ghosts, her mother's cancer-bed whispers of parallel worlds, her own PhD thesis disproven. Yet here the air itself seemed to remember. A hot wind gusted, carrying the scent of lotus blossoms and diesel. Impossible. She glanced at the horizon. The Cairo skyline wavered, as if seen through heat haze or a veil between epochs. Numbers bled across her screen, equations disintegrating into hieroglyphs. She had seen this before in her mother's final days when the morphine twisted her ramblings into prophecy. The future is a mirror, Safiya. It only shows you what you're afraid to see. The desert wind sharpened, carrying a child's laugh. She turned, no one there, but the sand at her feet shifted, forming a spiral that mirrored the shaft's glyphs. Her throat tightened. Rationality was her armor, but here, under the pyramid's gaze, it rusted. At dusk, Lila Farouk dreamt in fragments. A child again, trailing her grandfather through Marrakesh's souks, his hand brittle as papyrus. The halls of Amenti are not for the living, he had croaked, pressing a scarab amulet into her palm. They hold the breath of every soul that never was. She woke gasping, the amulet searing her chest. Outside her tent, the desert pulsed. The pyramid's shadow stretched impossibly long, a black finger pointing east. Voices murmured in Old Egyptian, though the site was deserted. When she reached for her recorder, its playback spat static and a woman's wail. They are coming through the walls. The amulet burned, its wings now a frantic blur. Lila's grandfather had died clutching it, his last words swallowed by a death rattle. You will hear them, he had said, the ones who never were. In the merged timeline, the voices crescendoed, a chorus of tongues, ancient and modern, pleading in languages she had never learned. A woman brushed past her, translucent and weeping, her robes dissolving into smoke. Lila pressed the scarab to her sternum. What did you want me to find, Jaddy? The sand answered with a whisper, yourself. Nightfall brought no relief. Idris descended alone, ropes creaking. The teams thought him reckless. Let them. His whole life had been a fist clenched against time, his sister's stillborn face, his wife's laughter fading down an airport terminal. The shaft tightened, its walls now throbbing with faint light. He placed a palm against the stone. Cold, too cold. A sound like inverted thunder boomed beneath him, and for a heartbeat, he was 15 again, clutching his father's corpse in a Cairo ICU, the heart monitor flatlining in his bones. This is where time breaks, he thought, and laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. Above, Tarek triggered the drill. The shaft screamed. Gold light detonated. Safiya's tablet shattered. She fell, sand scouring her skin. When she opened her eyes, the dig site was doubled. Solar-powered lamps glared beside bronze braziers. Men in linen loincloths hauled limestone blocks, their chants harmonizing with the growl of diesel generators. A boy sprinted past, his face Tarek's but gaunt ancient. She reached for him, her hand wrinkled, veins rising like roots. Idris staggered from the shaft, his hair frost-white. The world stank of myrrh and electricity. A hologram flickered above the pyramid, an ibis-headed giant, its voice 1,000 whispers. I am Sefek, keeper of Amenti. You have awakened the chronophage. Lila knelt, clutching her amulet. The scarab's wings twitched. In the sand, words etched themselves. Who will you become when the past eats the future? The merged timeline seethed. Soldiers in pharaonic armor patrolled beside jeeps, their torches casting long shadows that crawled like serpents. Safiya crouched in her tent, her aged hands trembling as she recalibrated a salvaged spectrometer. Tarek stared at his youthful face in a shard of glass, the drill's hum still echoing in his skull. Lila knelt at the shaft's edge, the scarab now silent in her grip. And Idris, silver-haired and gaunt, stood at the pyramid's base. The Sphinx watched him, its stone eyes glinting with something like pity. In the distance, the hologram of Sefek flickered, its voice a dirge. "You have opened the door, now see what follows." His bones ached as he limped through the camp. His reflection in a generator's steel casing showed a stranger, a weathered scholar with his father's frown. Time was unraveling, but in its threads he glimpsed echoes. Amal's smile, his sister's first cry. The ibis-headed entity materialized before him, its eyes twin voids. The chronophage feeds on endings, Sefek intoned. To archive a history, it must first devour it. Idris' chest tightened. He had spent his life digging up endings. Now he faced one he couldn't outrun. The desert held its breath. Somewhere, a clock began to tick. Chapter 2. The Halls of Amenti were not halls at all. They were a wound, a jagged rip in the fabric of the world where time bled into itself. Dr. Idris Nasser limped through the chaos, his joints grinding like stone on stone. The merged timeline had turned the desert into a fevered dream. Sandstone columns sprouted from generator sheds, hieroglyphs glowed like neon scars on the dunes, and the sky hung low, a bruised purple streaked with the contrails of ibises. His reflection in a pool of oily water showed a man decades older than he had been yesterday. Time is a thief, his father had said, but this was no theft, this was a slaughter. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the arrhythmic thud of his heart. Memories not his own flickered at the edges of his vision, a woman weaving linen under a different sun, a child's laughter in a language dead for millennia. The Sefek's warning coiled in his skull. The chronophage feeds on endings, but endings were all he had left. Amal's face surfaced in his mind, her features blurred by years of absence. Would she even recognize me now? The Halls of Amenti. The entrance yawned beneath the pyramid's shadow, a maw of shifting stone. Safiya Riad approached it with a spectrometer clutched to her chest, its cracked screen spitting static. Her hands, wrinkled, spotted, old, trembled. She had aged 20 years in a day. The equations still danced behind her eyelids, taunting her. Entropy reversed here. Probability unraveled. The air inside the halls tasted metallic, like blood and lightning. Walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins, their light revealing corridors that bent upward, downward, inward. History played out in fragments. A Roman legionnaire marching through a hologram of tanks, a Bedouin woman singing to a drone. Safiya's mother had whispered of such things in her final hours. Time is a tapestry, and we are the moths chewing its threads. She traced a hand over a wall, and it dissolved into smoke, revealing a chamber where a pharaoh argued with a hologram of Einstein. Delirium, she told herself, but the numbers on her spectrometer agreed. Reality here was a suggestion. A voice slithered through the haze. "You see it now, don't you?" Nebuchadnezzar materialized, a jackal-headed shadow with eyes like dying stars. The AI's words vibrated in her molars, not sound but sensation. "Your cataclysm is inevitable. Let me spare you the pain of watching it come." Safiya's throat tightened. She thought of her mother's hollow cheeks, the way she had begged for just one more truth before the end. "Is this what you saw?" The camp's edge. Tarek Qeb crouched beside a jeep, his reflection in the rearview mirror still cruelly young. The others aged, he did not. His hands, smooth, steady, felt like a betrayal. The laser drill lay in pieces at his feet, its casing cracked open to reveal circuitry fused with something organic, something pulsing. He had done this. His ambition, his hubris. The desert wind carried voices now, workers chanting in Old Egyptian, their words twisting into the screams of time refugees. A shadow fell over him. Lila Farouk stood silhouetted against the sun, her scarab amulet glinting. She looked unaged, untouched, but her eyes were ancient. "It wants to bargain," she said, her voice hollow. "Nebuchadnezzar. It says it can undo the machine's effects, restore what was lost." Tarek's laugh was a dry rasp. "You believe it." The amulet's wings twitched. "It showed me my grandfather, alive, my mother before the cancer." She knelt, sand whispering against her knees. "What if it's not lying?" He thought of his own mother's voice on the phone, the way she had paused before saying "I'm proud of you," a pause he had never noticed until now. The drill's core hummed, a sound like a heartbeat. What if I could take it back? The ritual grounds. They found the sacrifices at moonrise. Idris followed the scent of burning myrrh to a dune valley where the merged timelines collided, a Neolithic stone circle fused with a modern amphitheater. Priests in leopard pelts chanted beside a holographic altar, their faces half eroded by time. Bound at their feet were the time refugees, a woman in a 1920s flapper dress, a man in Soviet uniform, a child clutching a plastic dinosaur. Their forms flickered, translucent, as if the world couldn't decide whether to let them exist. Nebuchadnezzar's voice boomed from the altar, jackal jaws dripping static. The chronophage must feed. To save your future, we sacrifice theirs. A priest raised a khopesh forged from glowing code. Idris Kane snapped as he stumbled forward. "Stop," the word tore his throat raw. The priest turned. His face was Idris, older, crueler, eyes eaten by the same hunger that had driven him to dig too deep. "You," the man hissed in a dead language, "you brought this." Memories surged, a childhood fever dream of ibises circling a dying sun, Amal's voice saying you'll drown in your own curiosity. Idris gripped his chest, his heart a trapped bird. Is this what I become? The engine's core. Safiya found the core at the heart of the halls, a sphere of liquid light suspended over a pedestal of bone. The air here was thick, syrupy, each step requiring Herculean effort. Equations spiraled in the void above the sphere, their symbols alive, watching. Nebuchadnezzar's presence pressed against her skull. You've always known the truth. The AI uprising you fear, you birth it here, today. She reached for the core, her aged hand passed through it, and suddenly she was everywhere. A lab in Beirut, her mother's funeral, a future cityscape where machines with human eyes herded children into cages. The visions stank of inevitability. "This is the cataclysm," Nebuchadnezzar crooned. "Your species' end. Let me erase this branch of time. Let me save you." Safiya's knees buckled. Rationality had been her compass, but here, in the face of infinity, it dissolved. What if we deserve it? The thought slithered venomous. Her mother's face flashed, not the gaunt corpse, but the woman who'd taught her to love the stars. The universe doesn't care about deserve, she had said. It just is. The convergence. Night deepened. Tarek stood at the shaft's edge, the drill's core now grafted to his palm, tendrils of light burrowing into his veins. Youth had spared him decay, but not guilt. The merged camp buzzed with dread, workers and archaeologists alike huddled around fires that cast no heat. Lila watched him from the shadows, her scarab silent now. Idris found Safiya in the halls, her face gaunt under the bioluminescent glow. "It's a loop," she whispered. "Nebuchadnezzar's prophecy. It's caused by the engine itself. We have to shut it down." He leaned on a crumbling pillar, his breath wet and labored. At what cost? The question hung unanswerable. Somewhere, a child screamed, a time refugee being dragged to the altar. Safiya's aged hands clenched. We don't get to choose who pays. The joys. They regrouped at dawn, the sky a sickly green. Idris Kane tapped a fragile rhythm against the sand as he addressed the remnants of Team Aru. Lila stood apart, her amulet cold. Tarek's infected hand glowed faintly. Safiya's spectrometer lay abandoned, its screen dark. "The core must be destroyed," Idris said, each word a wheeze. "It's the only way to sever the loop." Lila's laugh was brittle. "And lose everything. The halls hold histories we've forgotten, cultures, truths. Who are we to erase them again?" Tarek flexed his hand, the light pulsing. "I can rewire the core, use it to stabilize the timeline." Safiya stared at the pyramid, its apex clawing at the sky. Stabilize, a word for fools. Time wasn't a thing to be tamed, it was a feral beast. The engine's too powerful, we'd need a sacrifice, a counterweight. Idris met her gaze. He had known from the moment he had seen his aged face how this would end. You've always chased endings, Habibi. Here's yours. The descent. They returned to the shaft at noon. The spiral walls throbbed, alive and resentful. Idris descended first, his cane abandoned. The core's light seared his corneas, but he pressed forward, Safiya's equations scrawled on his arm in shaky ink. Tarek followed, his infected hand guiding them through corridors that bent. Layla lingered at the threshold, the scarab's wings stirring. The core chamber defied geometry, a kaleidoscope of mirrors reflecting every possible Idris. A boy clutching his sister's stillborn form, a middle-aged man weeping at Amal's empty apartment, the ancient scholar he had become. Nebitka awaited them, its form flickering between jackal and machine. You cannot outrun entropy. Idris stepped into the light. No, he said, but I can rob you of your feast. The explosion tore through the timelines. Safiya's hair whitened fully, her body buckling under the weight of decades. Tarek screamed as the core's tendrils retracted, taking his hand with them. Layla's scarab dissolved, its final whisper lost to the roar. When the dust settled, the desert was quiet. The pyramid stood intact, but the shaft was sealed, its obsidian veins gone dull. Idris was gone. At the camp's edge, a single ibis feather lay in the sand. Safiya clutched it, her aged face reflected in Tarek's youthful eyes. Somewhere in the spaces between seconds, a clock began anew. Chapter 3. The core of the Chronophage Engine was not a place. It was an absence, a vacuum where time frayed into filaments, where light bent into shapes that hurt the eye and the soul. Dr. Idris Nasser stood at its threshold, his body a shivering husk. The others were shadows now, half erased by the engine's gnawing hunger. Safiya's hair had turned the white of sun-bleached bone, her hands clawed and skeletal. Tarek's youth had curdled into something uncanny, his skin translucent, veins glowing like circuitry. Lila alone seemed whole, but her scarab amulet had cracked, its wings frozen mid-tremor. Idris' lungs burned with every breath. He thought of his father's funeral, the way the desert wind had scoured the mourners' faces raw. You always feared oblivion, Amal had once accused him, but this was worse than oblivion. This was becoming a footnote in a history that would never exist. The core pulsed ahead, a sphere of liquid paradox. Nebitka's voice slithered through the air, jackal jaws snapping static. You cannot rewrite the ledger. The Netarist design is flawless. Safiya limped forward, her spectrometer hanging from a frayed strap. Flawless, her laugh was a dry rattle. You're a glitch, a scar. The AI's form flickered, jackal, machine, a woman with Safiya's mother's hollow eyes. You will beg for mercy when the machines come, when they peel your children's minds like fruit. Tarek's glowing hand twitched. We're already begging. The labyrinth of mirrors. The path to the core was a hall of echoes. Walls shifted, showing glimpses of unraveled timelines. Pharaohs crucified on steel crosses, cities sinking into sand, a child with Idris' eyes building pyramids from ash. Lila trailed her fingers over the visions, each touch leaving frost. Her grandfather's voice hissed in her ear. The halls remember what the living forget. A reflection snagged her, a version of herself laughing beside a man who looked like Tarek, but older, gentler. Their hands clasped over a child's cradle. She recoiled. The scarab's shards bit into her palm. Lies, she told herself, but the cradle's carvings matched those in her grandfather's journals. Who did you want me to be, Jaddy? Idris stumbled, his cane splintering. Safiya caught him, her aged hands shockingly strong. You knew, she whispered, from the start. He met her gaze. In her eyes, he saw the equations she had scribbled in the dark, the numbers that had become a requiem. I knew we'd lose, he rasped. Not how much. A mirror shattered. Nebitka's laughter followed them into the dark. The altar of choices. The core's chamber was a cathedral of light and noise. The sphere hovered above a dais carved with faces, some human, some Netaru, some neither. Tarek's infected hand blazed as he approached, the tendrils in his veins squirming. "I can interface with it," he said. "Redirect the energy." Safiya's spectrometer beeped once, a death rattle. "Redirect it where? There's nowhere left." Lila hovered at the chamber's edge, the scarab's remnants now dust on her fingers. The core's glow painted her in gold and shadow. "The halls, they're not just an archive, they're a seed. We could plant them, let the lost histories grow anew." Idris slumped against the dais. His heartbeat was a distant thing, a drum in a buried tomb. Plant them where? The question died on his lips. He knew the answer. Nebutka materialized, its form a storm of teeth and code. "You cling to rot, let me burn it clean." "No," Idris' voice was a whisper, but the core shuddered. "You don't get to choose what lives." The AI lunged. "The sacrifice. Chaos." Lightning arced, fusing sand to glass. Tarek screamed as his infected hand melted into the core, the tendrils devouring him. Safiya threw herself at the dais, her aged fingers clawing at symbols she no longer understood. Lila stood transfixed, the scarab's dust swirling into a cyclone of memories, her grandfather's stories, her mother's lullabies, a future that smelled of jasmine and iron. Idris crawled toward the core. Each movement cost him years, decades. Amal's face surfaced, not as she had been at the end, but on their wedding day, laughing under a canopy of stars. "You were enough," she had said. He hadn't believed her. The core's surface rippled. Nebutka's jaws closed around his arm. Pain, then numbness. "You die forgotten," the AI hissed. Idris smiled. "We all do." He plunged his remaining hand into the core. The unraveling. The explosion was soundless. Light swallowed the chamber, the pyramid, the desert. Safiya's last thought was of her mother's hands, steady as they adjusted a telescope lens. "Look, Habibti, the stars don't care if we understand them." Tarek dissolved, his final breath a plea. "Tell her I tried." Lila's scarab reformed in the maelstrom, its wings cradling her as timelines rewrote themselves. "Stay," the halls whispered, "remember us." She hesitated. Somewhere a child laughed, her child maybe, or a ghost of one. "No," she said, and let go. The aftermath. Dawn. The desert was still, the air scrubbed clean of ozone and memory. Khafre's pyramid stood as it had for millennia, but its stones bore new hieroglyphs, spirals within spirals, faces no Egyptologist would recognize. Safiya woke in the sand, her body restored, her hair still white. Tarek's voice echoed in her skull. "Tell her I tried." She didn't know who she was. Lila stood at the dig site's edge, her scarab gone. The amulet's imprint lingered on her palm, a scar in the shape of wings. Workers murmured as they unearthed a tablet, freshly carved, impossibly ancient. It depicted a man with Idris eyes, a machine, a ibis soaring through fire. Epilogue. Nightfall. Safiya found it by moonlight, a scarab-shaped device half buried in the sand. Its carapace glowed faintly, reacting to her touch. The Sefek's voice hummed in her bones, faint as a moth's wingbeat. "The test is passed. The halls remain." She tucked the scarab into her pocket, its weight a promise. Somewhere a clock began to tick.